By the middle of the 19th century, Glasgow had become one of the most important industrial cities in Britain. Situated along the banks of the River Clyde, the city expanded rapidly as shipbuilding, textile production, and heavy engineering drove economic growth. Factories, workshops, and shipyards dominated the landscape, drawing workers from rural Scotland and beyond, who hoped to secure steady employment and improved living conditions. This rapid influx of people caused Glasgow's population to grow at an unprecedented rate. Infrastructure failed to keep pace with expansion, and housing shortages became severe. Large tenement buildings were constructed to accommodate working families, often packing multiple households into single rooms. These buildings frequently lacked proper sanitation, ventilation, and access to clean water. Disease spread easily in such conditions, and outbreaks of illnesses like cholera were common among the city's poorest residents. Despite these hardships, Glasgow also developed a thriving cultural life. Theaters, music halls, and public libraries offered moments of escape and education. In 1845, the Glasgow School of Art was founded, contributing to the city's reputation as a growing center of creativity and learning. These achievements, however, stood in stark contrast to the realities faced by much of the working class. For those living at the bottom of society, daily life was shaped by poverty, overcrowding, and insecurity. Survival often required difficult choices, and desperation became a familiar condition. It was within these impoverished districts, where inequality and neglect were most visible, that Helen Blackwood and others like her lived, navigating an existence defined by hardship and limited opportunity. Helen Blackwood lived in a tenement room in Crowley's Land, in the New Vennel area of Glasgow, an overcrowded part of the city shaped by poverty and instability. The room itself was small and cramped, shared by several people whose lives had converged through necessity rather than choice. Space was limited, privacy non-existent, and daily life unfolded within close quarters that left little room for comfort or safety. Helen shared the room with Smith McFarland, a young man with whom she had been in a relationship for some time. Also living there were Mary Hamilton and Anne Marshall, two young women struggling to survive in an unforgiving society. With few opportunities available to them, both women had turned to prostitution as a means of earning money. Their presence reflected the harsh economic realities faced by many women living at the margins of Victorian Glasgow. In addition to the adults, two young brothers, William and James Shillinglaw, also occupied the room. William was 11 years old, and James was just 9. Their father had died, and their mother lived in extreme poverty, unable to properly care for them. Although the boys occasionally attended school, their lives were marked by uncertainty and hardship common among poor children of the period. Many children in similar circumstances were forced into workhouses or left to survive on the streets. Smith McFarland took pity on the brothers and allowed them to stay in the room, offering them shelter in an otherwise bleak existence. The crowded household, shaped by desperation and fragile relationships, formed a tense environment where hardship was constant and stability was rare. Within these confines, every action, argument, and decision carried greater weight, setting conditions in which conflict could emerge easily, and consequences would later prove irreversible for everyone involved. There present. Saturday, the 11th of June, 1853, was a warm summer day in Glasgow, offering a brief contrast to the city's relentless industrial pace. Many residents sought relief outdoors, gathering in public spaces to enjoy the weather and escape crowded living conditions. Glasgow Green, the city's oldest and largest public park, became a popular destination, with families and workers drawn to its open lawns, winding paths, and proximity to the River Clyde. While others enjoyed the park, Mary Hamilton and Anne Marshall followed a different course. As Saturday was often profitable, the two women went into the city center to look for clients rather than joining the crowds on the green. There, they encountered two sailors from the Merchant Navy, Alexander Boyd and James Law, who were on leave and had been drinking heavily throughout the day. Beer, gin, and whiskey were common fixtures of working-class life, and both men were already intoxicated when they met the women. Mary and Anne joined the sailors as they continued their evening together, though the women themselves did not drink much. As time passed, conversation continued, and alcohol flowed freely for the men. Eventually, Mary suggested that they return to the room she shared with others. In their drunken state, both sailors agreed without hesitation. For a short time, the group separated before making their way back toward Crowley's land. The decision to return to the crowded tenement marked a turning point. What began as an ordinary Saturday shaped by routine survival was ending. Mary Hamilton arrived back at the tenement room first, accompanied by James Law. Not long afterward, Anne Marshall entered with Alexander Boyd, whose level of intoxication left him barely aware of his surroundings. His movements were unsteady, and his ability to comprehend what was happening around him was clearly impaired. The small room quickly became crowded, its limited space amplifying every sound and movement within it. Soon after their arrival, Helen Blackwood returned to the room with Smith McFarland. Their entrance altered the atmosphere immediately, introducing a noticeable tension into the already confined environment. Beneath Helen's bed, the two Shillinglaw brothers, William and James, lay resting. The noise of the adults disturbed their sleep, leaving them awake and alert as events unfolded above them. At some point, Helen obtained money from Alexander Boyd and left the room to purchase more whiskey. She returned shortly afterward with a new bottle. As the group continued drinking, Mary Hamilton placed something into Boyd's cup before pouring whiskey into it and handing it to him. Boyd drank the contents without question. Following this, his condition worsened. His movements became more erratic, and his demeanor grew increasingly unstable. The air inside the room felt charged as alcohol, exhaustion, and close quarters combined. Boyd's already impaired state deteriorated further, and his demeanor shifted toward aggression. The confined space left little room to avoid confrontation, and the presence of multiple people heightened the sense of unease. This sequence of actions unfolded rapidly and without interruption. Each decision built upon the last, creating a volatile situation shaped by drink, overcrowding, and tension. Within the narrow walls of the tenement room, the conditions were set for violence, and the fragile balance holding the group together was on the verge of collapsing under mounting strain. Alexander Boyd's behavior shifted suddenly from unsteadiness to violence. In his intoxicated state, he attempted to strike Helen Blackwood, swinging wildly in the confined space of the room. The blow did not land. Reacting immediately, Helen reached for the nearest object available, a chamber pot, and struck Boyd on the head with force. The impact was severe. The chamber pot shattered, and Boyd collapsed to the floor, where his head struck a stone stool inside the room. He lay motionless and unconscious, badly injured and unable to respond. The room fell into a tense stillness as the seriousness of his condition became apparent to those present. Rather than attempting to seek help or render aid, Helen Blackwood and Anne Marshall began searching Boyd's body for money or valuables. They removed his clothing until he was left in his undergarments, finding little of value in the process. This marked a clear shift in events, moving away from a moment of defensive violence toward deliberate actions taken against a helpless man. Alexander Boyd remained unconscious on the floor throughout this time. His condition did not improve, and no effort was made to revive him. Instead, attention turned away from his injuries and toward what should be done next. It was at this point that a decision was made. Helen Blackwood, Smith McFarland, and Anne Marshall resolved to remove Boyd from the room entirely. This unexplained choice would determine the outcome of the night and lead to the fatal events that followed. Together, Helen Blackwood, Smith McFarland, and Anne Marshall lifted Alexander Boyd from the floor and carried him toward the window. The room was on the third floor of the tenement, overlooking the cobblestones below. Without attempting to seek help or assess his condition, they pushed Boyd headfirst through the window opening. His body fell to the ground beneath with a heavy impact, leaving little doubt that he was gravely injured or dead. In the immediate aftermath, Helen moved quickly to shape the scene. She went to the window and shouted that the man had fallen out, presenting the event as an accident. The broken remains of the chamber pot used earlier were discarded, reinforcing the appearance that Boyd's fall had not been deliberate. The noise of the impact and the shouting drew the attention of nearby residents, who looked from windows and doorways to see what had happened. A policeman passing through the area responded to the disturbance. Upon examining the body lying on the cobblestones, he determined that Alexander Boyd was dead. Additional officers arrived, and an inquiry began into the circumstances surrounding the incident. News of the death spread quickly through the surrounding streets, where speculation and gossip followed close behind. As police sought witnesses and attempted to understand what had occurred, Helen Blackwood, Smith McFarland, Mary Hamilton, and Anne Marshall fled the tenement. Hidden beneath the bed, William and James Shillinglaw witnessed everything and later provided investigators with a complete account of the night's events. Helen Blackwood, Smith McFarland, Mary Hamilton, and Anne Marshall were arrested the day after Alexander Boyd's death and charged with murder. The case attracted immediate attention, and on the 21st of July, 1853, just 6 weeks after the incident, the prosecution set out to reconstruct the events that took place inside the tenement room at Crowley's Land. Witness testimony formed the core of the case. William and James Shillinglaw were called to the stand, recounting what they had seen and heard from beneath Helen Blackwood's bed. They described the arrival of the two sailors, the drinking, Helen receiving money to buy whiskey, and Mary Hamilton placing something into Alexander Boyd's cup. They testified that Boyd became aggressive, attempted to strike Helen, and was hit with a chamber pot, falling unconscious and striking his head on a stone stool. The brothers further stated that Boyd was stripped while unconscious, and that Helen Blackwood suggested throwing him out of the window. They described how Helen, Smith McFarland, and Anne Marshall lifted Boyd and threw him headfirst onto the street below. Their testimony provided a detailed account of the sequence of events leading to Boyd's death. Another witness, Jane Lee, supported key aspects of this narrative. She testified that she observed the events through a door and heard remarks about profiting from Boyd's belongings. Medical evidence presented by doctors confirmed that Boyd's injuries were consistent with a fall from a height, though they could not determine whether he was alive at the moment he was thrown from the window. The defense attempted to undermine the credibility of the witnesses, emphasizing the chaotic environment, intoxication, and poverty surrounding the incident. Despite these efforts, the prosecution's case remained strong as the trial moved toward its conclusion. After hearing the evidence, the judge addressed the jury and summarized the case, outlining the testimonies and medical findings presented during the trial. The jury then retired to deliberate, tasked with determining the responsibility of each accused individual in the death of Alexander Boyd. After a period of consideration, they returned with their verdicts. Helen Blackwood, Smith McFarland, and Anne Marshall were found guilty. Mary Hamilton, however, received a verdict of not proven. The decision produced mixed reactions within the courtroom. Some viewed the outcome as a reflection of differing levels of involvement, while others interpreted it as an acknowledgement of uncertainty surrounding certain aspects of the case. The guilty verdicts carried immediate and serious consequences for those convicted. Anne Marshall's case took a different turn following the verdict. Despite being found guilty, she was recommended for mercy. As a result, she was spared execution and instead sentenced to transportation to Australia. This decision sparked criticism and disbelief in sections of the press, where many questioned whether the punishment matched her role in the events that led to Boyd's death. Helen Blackwood and Smith McFarland were returned to prison to await execution. While confined, applied for permission to marry Helen. Authorities denied the request, stating that such a union was inappropriate given their circumstances and impending sentences. Beyond the courtroom, the case resonated throughout Glasgow. Public discussion reflected broader anxieties about crime, poverty, and social neglect. For many, the trial highlighted the harsh conditions endured by the city's poorest residents and forced an uncomfortable examination of the environment in which such violence had occurred. Thursday, the 11th of August, 1853, marked the final chapter in the case of Helen Blackwood and Smith McFarland. Outside the new jail in Glasgow, thousands of people gathered to witness their executions. Despite the somber nature of the occasion, the crowd's presence reflected the continued public fascination with punishment and justice in 19th-century society. The executions were carried out by William Calcraft, a well-known executioner who had traveled from London for the event. As the condemned were brought to the scaffold, the atmosphere remained heavy and subdued. In the moments before their deaths, Helen Blackwood and Smith McFarland shared a final act of commitment. Standing before the chaplain and witnesses, declared his intention to take Helen as his wife. Helen consented, and affirmed that she had always been a true and faithful wife to him. The chaplain concluded the declaration, and under Scottish law at the time, the spoken exchange constituted a legal marriage. The marriage was brief. Almost immediately after the declaration, the trap was released, and Helen Blackwood and Smith McFarland were hanged side by side. Their deaths brought the case to a formal close, but the story did not end there. As the crowd dispersed, accounts of the execution and the marriage on the gallows spread rapidly through the city. Newspapers devoted further coverage to the event, reinforcing its place in public memory. In the aftermath, the case came to symbolize the wider social conditions of Glasgow, reflecting the enduring impact of poverty, inequality, and neglect on the lives of the working class, and the consequences that followed when desperation shaped human actions.